the Rock and Roll Unraveled Show.
I'm Derek Shelmadine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled show. Now, some covers are far better known than the original versions of the song. We're going to take a look at some of these very well-known covers, but have a listen to the less well-known originals. We'll start with All Along the Watchtower. Now, that was written by Bob Dylan and started life as an album track for him. But the big hit, of course, came for the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Jimi Hendrix had the chart success in America in the September of 1968. Interestingly enough, it was the only hit single Hendrix had in America, made number 20. And in the October, it was a hit in the UK charts, but that was his fifth UK hit single, got him a number 5 in the UK. Now, this is a real time of change for Jimi Hendrix. He released his third album, Electric Ladyland, around the same time as All Along the Watchtower, and this very much marked the end of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Chas Chandler, well, he moved on, relinquished his management of Hendrix, and Noel Redding, the bassist, also moved on. He formed his own band, Fat Mattress. Now, unlike the first two albums, Are You Experienced and Axis Bold as Love, they were simply the Jimi Hendrix trio of Hendrix, Redding and drummer Mitch Mitchell. Now, Electric Ladyland, that featured a host of rock luminaries. Bob Dylan's version appeared on his album John Wesley Harding, and that was released towards the end of 1967. And it was his first album release since his motorcycle accident in mid-66. Now, this was also a time of change for Dylan as well. On the 29th of July 66, he was injured in a motorcycle accident near his home in Woodstock, New York. Now, the circumstances and extent of Dylan's injuries have always been shrouded in mystery. Dylan himself gives various accounts of the incident. Now, at the time of the accident, he'd recently returned from his notorious European tour, where he was backed by an electric band, and the tour included the infamous Jeers of Judas at a concert in Manchester. Well, Dylan had upset some of his more traditional folk music fans by performing with an electric band. A couple of months before the accident, Dylan had released the very much acclaimed double album Blonde on Blonde, and there's considerable speculation followed Dylan's accident as to why he stayed out of the limelight so long. I mean, fans had to wait 18 months for his next album, John Wesley Harding. And from that album, this is Bob Dylan with All Along the Watchtower. Our next song, Go Now, written by Milton Bennett and Larry Banks. The original was from Bessie Banks, and yes, they are related, but of course it's always associated for the big hit that the Moody Blues had with the song. Now, the Moody Blues played their first gig on the 2nd of May 1964 at the Carlton Ballroom in Birmingham. They actually came together as a Birmingham supergroup. They'd all been in other Brummie bands that were very successful locally. Denny Lane, guitarist, was from Denny Lane and the Diplomats. Ray Thomas, flute and harmonica, and Mike Pinder, keyboards guy. They were from El Riot and the Rebels, and also the Crew Cats. The drummer, Graham Edge, was from Jerry Levine and the Avengers, and the bassist, Clint Warwick, from Danny King and the Dukes. Now, this is the lineup that recorded their first album, The Magnificent Moodies, and of course, this single, Go Now. Well, Denny Lane left early on in the group's career. He left in 1966 to set up his own band, Denny Lane's Electric String Band. Well, they released their single in the November of 64. Denny Lane took lead vocal on this particular single. Now, he went on famously to join Paul McCartney in Wings. And Alex Murray, also known as Alex Wharton, he produced the single, and he was also the band's co-manager. And he'd previously been one half of the Most Brothers, and the other half was legendary producer Mickey Most. He also produced a promo video for the song, and that's one of rock's first ever promo videos. And of course, by the end of the year, Moody Blues were at the UK's #1 spot. Well, Bessie Banks was an R&B singer, and she released her original version in America 9 months earlier, entered the R&B charts there on the 7th of March 1964, very precise with the date because it was only there for a week. It made number 40, and that was the extent of Bessie Banks' chart career. It wasn't a UK hit, it wasn't a crossover hit in America, and in fact it turned out to be Bessie Banks' only R&B top 40 hit. Now the song was produced by Lieber and Stoller, very well-known songwriters, and they formed Tiger Records, and Go Now was the only Tiger single to chart. Now Bessie Banks was in a group called Three Guys and a Doll, and that's where she met band member Larry Banks, and they got married. She left them and they became the Four Fellows, and Larry Banks with his friend Milton Bennett, well, they wrote Go Now to break Bessie Banks nationally, but sadly that never happened. This is that original Bessie Banks version of Go Now. Our next song's the wonderful I Fought the Law. Now that was written by Sonny Curtis. The original version was by the Crickets, and if you're a child of the 60s you probably associate it with Bobby Fuller, the Bobby Fuller 4. And if the 70s was your era, you'd probably associate it with The Clash. Bobby Fuller released his first version in the July of 1964, and that version was released just as Bobby Fuller, and that was on the Exeter label, based in El Paso, Texas, and it was Bobby Fuller that actually owned that Exeter label. Soon after this, he relocated to Los Angeles. Several more singles followed, different labels, different band names, and then he finally settled on the band name Bobby Fuller 4. In the November of 1965, he released it again, but this time as the Bobby Fuller 4, and that was on the Mustang label, and this is the version that gave him a hit on both sides of the Atlantic. It entered the Billboard Top 40 on the 12th of February 66, gave him a number 9, and a couple of months later it was in the UK charts. It was actually their only UK hit, but it gave him a number 33. The Clash found success with I Fought the Law when they released it as one of the tracks on their Cost of Living EP, and that EP managed to get into the singles chart, and this is mid-1979. Got to number 22, was their 7th UK hit. In November 1978, they'd released the album Give 'Em Enough Rope. Now that album was their second album in the UK, but it was released as their debut album in America. Their first UK album had simply been The Clash, and that was the album that was released as the band's second album in America, although it didn't have the same track listing as the UK version of the album. And in America, that was the album that included I Fought the Law. Because of this sort of mishmash of releases, the US album featured both drummers, Tory Crimes and Topper Headon, although it was Enough Rope that introduced UK fans to Topper Headon when that was released. The Crickets' original version was a post-Holly version of the Crickets. In early November, Buddy Holly had ended his business relationship with manager Norman Petty. Now Norman Petty had separate agreements with Buddy Holly and with the Crickets, and Jerry Allison and Joe B. Mauldin, they decided to stay with Norman Petty after Buddy Holly left. And Sonny Curtis joined them at the end of 1958. Now he actually had a relationship with Buddy Holly because he played on the early recording session back in January 1956, before Holly got together with the Crickets. And November-ish, 58, Earl Sinks joined the Crickets as lead singer. And then sadly, of course, Buddy Holly died in a plane crash on the 3rd of February 1959. Well, the Crickets recorded I Fought the Law on the 18th of May 1959, and Earl Sinks took the lead vocals there. Now, it was one of the first songs to be recorded by the Crickets after Buddy Holly's death, and the song was first released quite a while later on the 5th of December 1960 on the album In Style with the Crickets, and Earl Sinks in fact parted company with the Crickets shortly after that. It was released as a single in the UK at the end of 1961, although it did fail to chart. Well, this is the original version. This is the Crickets with I Fought the Law. You're listening to Derek Shelmadine with the Rock and Roll Unravelled Show. We're looking at some well-known covers and listening to some less well-known originals. But before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Just check out the link to the competition on the homepage, answer the simple question, and you're in the draw for a signed copy. Rock and Roll Unravelled tells a story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk, and Record Collector magazine, in its review of the book, described it as comprehensive and invaluable. Thank you very much, Record Collector. Good luck with the competition. Meanwhile, back at the covers. Well, our next song is a real classic, Hallelujah, written by Leonard Cohen, and obviously the original by Leonard Cohen. There have been hundreds of covers, but we're going to take a peek at the John Cale, Jeff Buckley and Alexandra Burke covers. Now, John Cale's was one of the earliest, and it's the first cover I could actually find. He, of course, came to fame as bass player and founding member of the iconic New York band Velvet Underground. Now, Leonard Cohen released his original in 1984, and John Cale's first version of Hallelujah, was recorded a few times, didn't come till 1991, and that was for a compilation album called I'm Your Fan, The Songs of Leonard Cohen. Now, Jeff Buckley is generally considered to be the definitive version of Hallelujah, originally released in 1994 on his album Grace. Actually, the only album to be released in his lifetime. He died in 1997. But it was released as a single by Jeff Buckley as well, and that's got really quite an interesting history. In June 2007, it was coupled with I Know It's Over. Now, the B-side has a writing credit for words by Morrissey and music by Johnny Marr. So what you've got there is a coupling of Leonard Cohen with the Smiths. That's a very jolly little single to have in your collection. Well, it gave him a hit, albeit a fairly quiet one. It was on the charts for a couple of weeks, managed to creep up to 65, but it was re-released in October 2008 and re-entered the charts, and he had a lot more success there. It was on the charts for 13 weeks. Now, 2008, X Factor was very popular in those days, and in that particular year, several protest groups popped up on social media encouraging fans to buy the Jeff Buckley version of the song. And this was to stop X Factor's Alexander Burke's version, giving Simon Cowell yet another Christmas #1. Well, the Christmas charts came out and it was Alexandra Burke 1, Jeff Buckley 2. And that was a very good Christmas for Leonard Cohen's bank balance. Well, Cohen's original version came out in 84 on his album Various Positions, and that was the last of 6 UK hit albums across a period of 1968 to 1985, and Hallelujah was released as a single in some countries in Europe around that time as well. And this is the original Leonard Cohen Hallelujah. You might well be surprised to find that the next song isn't the original that you think it is. This is Barbara Ann. It was written by Fred Fassett. And the original's by a doo-wop band called The Regents, and covered by Jan and Dean, of course the Beach Boys, and a great version by The Who. Well, the Beach Boys is by far the best known version of the song, and they released it on their 1965 album Beach Boys Party. It gave them a big hit on both sides of the Atlantic. It was a #2 in America, #3 in the UK, and that was actually their 17th Billboard Top 40 hit. How the recording came about's a great story. Well, we picked the story up with another popular surf duo, and that's Jan and Dean. They included Barbara Ann on their 1962 album, Jan and Dean's Golden Hits. That's 4 years before the Beach Boys. And if we jump forward then to 1965, the Beach Boys were in the studio to record their next album, Beach Boys Party, and Dean Torrance of Jan and Dean was in the recording studio next door, and he wandered into the Beach Boys studio. Now, the tape was rolling, and they began an impromptu rendition of Barbara Ann. Dean Torrance took the lead vocals. He, of course, knew the song because he'd recorded it some years before. Now, there's laughter and running commentary in the background of the Beach Boys version, And you can hear quite clearly someone saying, "It's Hal and his famous ashtrays." Well, that's a reference to Hal Blaine, drummer with the Wrecking Crew, session musicians. And he was chinking two ashtrays together. Hal Blaine, very major character on the West Coast there. He played on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds as well. He was also the drummer on most of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound hit singles. Now, the urban myth has it that Capitol, the record company, added this sort of impromptu bit of fun to the album Beach Boys Party, but they didn't bother to tell Brian Wilson. He was the producer and, of course, the leading light of the Beach Boys. He wasn't told about the addition because he was a perfectionist, and it was thought that he would probably try to veto the track going onto the album. Well, it went there. Probably the whole thing was recorded in about 15 minutes. What a great story. Now, The Who deserve an honourable mention, to say the least. On the 21st of October 66, they were on the TV show Ready, Steady, Go. That's the one that started The Weekend Starts Here. And on the show they played a number of songs, Batman, Disguises, Bucket Tea. And shortly afterwards they recorded an EP called Ready, Steady, Who. But for legal reasons, the songs recorded on the show couldn't be used for the Ready Steady Who EP. So they went into the studio, recorded some of those songs, and also added Barbara Ann to the EP. And that was very successful. It spent 5 weeks at number 1 in the EP chart. Now we come to the original version, the Regents. They started life as the Desires in the late 1950s and formed in New York. In 1958, they recorded what became the doo-wop classic Barbara Ann. It was written by Fred Fassett, and he was the brother of Chuck Fassett in the Desires, but they failed to secure a record deal at the time, and it all went very quiet, really. In 1961, the Consorts, a completely different group, were looking for a song. And one of the members of the group, Eddie Jacobucci, now he was the brother of Donnie Jacobucci in the Desires. He showed the Consorts the song Barbara Ann, and they liked it, took the song to Eddie Cicchetti, who was the owner of the local Cousins Records. And when Cicchetti contacted the writer Fred Fassett, Fred showed him the original Desires demo. Oh, sadly for the Consorts, Cicchetti much preferred the Desires version, and that was the one that was released. By now, of course, the Desires were calling themselves the Regents. When the March of 61 Barbara Ann was released as the Regents in New York on the Cousins label, and it was a very big hit locally in New York. It was leased to the G record label because they could provide a much bigger distribution facility, and it paid off because it was a crossover hit. It managed number 7 on the R&B charts, but on the Billboard Top 40 it became number 13. But sadly, as with 95% or more of doo-wop releases in the UK in the 50s and early 1960s, it failed to trouble the charts at all. Well, this is the original, the Regents, and Barbara Ann. You're listening to Derek Shelmadine's Rock and Roll Unravelled show, and we're taking a look at the original versions of some classic cover songs. Now, lots of bands and artists mentioned in the show have tour dates listed for venues and dates. To see the latest tour information, just check out my website, rockandrollunravelled.com. At the top, you'll see 1960s, 70s artists touring now, and you can see which of your favourite artists from the 1960s and 70s are out on the road. Well, back to the story. Now, our next song is again, like Barbara Ann, much better known for its cover version, and that's Sailing, written by Gavin Sutherland, and it started out as a Sutherland Brothers album track, but of course it was a massive hit and even a TV show theme for Rod Stewart. Now, Rod Stewart released the song originally in the summer of 1975 on his album Atlantic Crossing, and that was produced by Tom Dowd. The single was a massive hit. It was number 1 in the UK for 4 weeks, and that was his 8th UK hit. Rod Stewart was still with the Faces at the time, but they were falling apart. It was very much Rod Stewart and the Faces now. He'd completely eclipsed the rest of the band. and by the end of 1975, the Faces were history. The Sutherland Brothers released Sailing on their album Lifeboat, and that was in 1972, 3 years before the Rod Stewart version. Lifeboat was produced by Muff Winwood. He's the brother of Stevie Winwood. It was released by the Sutherland Brothers as a single in the summer of 1972. It peaked at number 54. Now, it was said to have been written with a Celtic feel to it, and there's a great quote from Gavin Sutherland, who wrote the song. And what he says, and I quote, "Most people take the song to be about a young guy telling his girl that he's crossing the Atlantic to be with her. In fact, the song's got nothing to do with romance or ships. It's an account of mankind's spiritual odyssey through life on his way to freedom and fulfillment with the spiritual being." Well, there you go. That's a rock and roll song for you. And this is the original version. This is the Sutherland Brothers with Sailing. Our next song has quite a journey. It started out as an R&B song, but became a rock and roll classic. And that's Piece of My Heart, written by Bert Burns and Jerry Ragavoy. The original was from Irma Franklin, but it was Janis Joplin who really made the song famous. Janis Joplin joined Big Brother and the Holding Company in the summer of 1966. They were based in San Francisco. But it was the following year, the June of 67, at the Monterey Pop Festival that famously established Janis Joplin's reputation. They were signed by Albert Grossman, and this led to a recording contract with Columbia. A couple of months later, they released their first album, Big Brother and the Holding Company. It was their second album in mid-1968, an album called Cheap Thrills, that included Piece of My Heart as one of the tracks. That was released as a single and was to be her only American hit single in her lifetime. It managed to get to number 12. Now, Janis Joplin, surprisingly enough, had no hit singles in the UK. At the end of 1968, she parted company with Big Brother and the Holding Company and formed her own band, Cosmic Blues Band. Irma Franklin was born in 1938 and was Aretha Franklin's older sister. When Emma was about 6 years old, the family moved to Detroit, and she sang in her father's choir. He was a Baptist minister. Now, the father was quite a strict sort of character and insisted she put college before a singing career, which she did. This meant she missed out on joining Motown's early roster and also missed out on a recording opportunity at Chess Records. Well, things changed after younger sister Aretha signed to Columbia in 1960 and had a very successful first album. So then, the following year, Irma signed to Epic. Now, Epic wasn't really a gospel or soul label, and they didn't really not know what to do with Irma. And at the end of her contract there in 1966, she quit the music business and went to work for IBM, the computer giant. Now, in 1967, she signed to Bert Burns at Shout Records, but she still kept on a day job at IBM. Now, Bert Burns, a writer, producer, record label owner, he also owned Bang, very associated with the Isley Brothers, Van Morrison, a main character in this period of rock and roll history. Piece of My Heart was released as a single at the end of 1967 and successful. It reached number 10 on the Billboard R&B Top 40. She had 2 hit singles in all, another one followed in 1969. Now, when Piece of My Heart hit the charts, Irma was still working at IBM, and she decided now, I think I'll quit the day job and really get stuck into my music full time. Sadly, it didn't quite work out like that. On the 30th of December 1967, Bert Burns died, and that was before Emma could capitalise on her success with an album or another hit single. Now, Bang fell apart after Bert's death, and in 1969 she moved across to Brunswick and released her first single. Sadly, things didn't get any better there. Well, Irma Franklin, the story of an R&B singer who could have been a legend. And this is the original version. This is Irma Franklin, Piece of My Heart. Our last song created a worldwide dance craze, and that was the twist. It was written by Hank Ballard, and the original came from Hank Ballard and the Midnighters. The worldwide dance craze, of course, was started by Chubby Checker with his cover version. Chubby Checker was born on the 3rd of October 1941. He was born Ernest Evans in Spring Gully, South Carolina. He worked at a produce market and he used to entertain the customers with impressions of popular singers. Now, market owner Henry Colt heard him and introduced him to TV host Dick Clark. Now, Dick Clark used a private recording by Evans, Chubby Checker, as a Christmas greetings card, and this actually led to a recording deal with Cameo Parkway. Well, there's a Christmas fairy tale. He released his first single in the summer of 1959, but it was actually the B-side, The Class, that gave him the hit. That was a number 38. Oh, what's great about this is the label describes the song as, and I quote, imitating Fats Domino, the Coasters, Elvis Presley, and, believe it or not, the Chipmunks. He released his second single in the August of 1960, and that was The Twist. And that gave him a number 1 for a week. And it also made number 2 on the Billboard R&B Top 40. Well, a month or so later, it entered the UK charts. A more modest hit in the UK. It was a number 44, and that was his first UK hit. And that was the song, of course, that inspired the dance sensation, The Twist. Hank Ballard and the Midnighters go back to the early 1950s. They started out as the Royals, an R&B vocal group. Hank Ballard joined in early 1952. But it was 1954 when they got their big break with Work With Me Annie. And that was a number 1 on the R&B charts for 7 weeks. Another song written by Hank Ballard. And this marked the transition from the band name from the Royals to the Midnighters. Now, Work With Me Annie is one of those landmark R&B singles. It was a controversial song, very racy lyrics. But thanks to DJs like Alan Freed, it was one of the first R&B songs by a black R&B group to be very popular with white teenagers. Hank Ballard and the Midnighters recorded The Twist at the back end of 1958. It started out as the B-side to Teardrops on Your Letter, and the DJs actually preferred the B-side, The Twist, and the coupling gave Hank Ballard and the Midnighters a double-sided R&B hit in the spring of 1959. But of course, it was the Chubby Checker version 18 months later that kick-started the whole Twist dance craze around the world. Well, that's it. I've been Derek Shelmadine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unraveled show and the story of some covers that were more famous than the originals. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show half as much as I've been putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, you can find me on Twitter at RNR Unraveled, Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled. And join me again next time for another look at some rock and roll unraveled. Well, to play us out, Chubby Checker started the worldwide dance craze, The Twist, but this is the original, recorded 18 months earlier. This is Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, The Twist.